That's great.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to the Nikhil Hogan Show, and I am joined with the great Professor Jonathan Leathwood. He is a professor of guitar and music theory at the Lamont School of Music at University of Denver. And I listen to my audience. I listen to requests, and I mean, this was one. Here, Isaac Bean. A shout out to Isaac Bean and Austin Color at Parlamento Guitar. Talking about the rule of the octave. You should have him on the show, maybe. He's a great improviser. And Austin from Parlamento Guitar said he would be great. He's an absolute wizard. And I mean, that's great. And I have a very brilliant audience. So, well, welcome, Professor Leathwood, to the show.
It's great to be with you, Nikhil.
Now,
how are you?
I'm great, and I play mainly piano now, but I started out on guitar, and guitar was I have a special fondness for the instrument. It's such a beautiful instrument. It's maybe one of the most piano, guitar. Those are always fighting in Singapore for for popularity. The two immensely popular instruments. And classical guitar actually is very popular in Singapore. And there's a lot of people who started guitar, at least promoting classical guitar here in Singapore. And so I did the lessons too as a kid. Um, and so it's really great to find people who have multi dimensions to their artistry. So they one thing I've noticed in Singapore is that the guitarists tend to be kind of they play solo works, they play it well, they memorize them, but there's not much ensemble playing. There's almost zero improvisation and zero composition. And so there's a big hole there, I think, in the culture in where I'm from. And I think a lot of people would agree in classical guitar, there's a bit of that. And so I like when someone is a composer, an improviser. I feel there's a full musicianship there. And these are the people I usually bring onto the show. I mean,
Yeah.
so Professor Leathwood, I'd love to. Why don't you tell us your story? How did you get into guitar, and what were your influences growing up?
Well, I started guitar when I was aged about 11, just under 11, and I think I recognize the kind of story you're telling about the development of the classical guitar as a concert instrument. So it was very much based on learning the repertoire, preparing to play concerts from memory, that kind of thing. Although I've always been very interested in improvisation and just living that life of the mind also with music. My first experiences are actually with the banjo and ukulele, which gives you that different sense of
Yeah.
of harmony. I remember working through a banjo tutor book by the great Pete Seeger that explained how simply why is a C major chord called a C major chord, and it blowing my mind, and then wanting to know all the chords and going through all of my music trying to find the chords. And it turns out that
It's not this,
that
is
way
it?
of simply working. Yes, that's the one. So everyone should everyone should read it. Um, uh, I think that sense of finding the harmony underlying the music, just starting off with the idea that is there some kind of an imaginary chordal accompaniment, was among my very first experiences. And of course, that opens the doorway to improvisation, because once you have the underlying harmonies, you can improvise on them. So we can talk about that a little bit more. And I know there's an awful lot I could say about my trajectory as a classical guitarist, but I suppose I'd just say that I've played in all kinds of places and really valued the experience of being a performer, because performing solo, even in that perhaps with that rather limited background that you were talking about, one always has the chance to create something on stage. So there is a certain sense of improvising with the audience. Um, a few years ago, I developed an I'm very much focused on teaching now, and my performing is in situations where there's maybe the stakes are lower, like maybe I'm talking about something, giving a master class, and then I can pick up the guitar as and when I want. And then the other thing I suppose I'd like to mention is that, in fact, after developing an injury, I became an Alexander technique teacher as well, and added that to my pedagogy. The Alexander technique is a method for learning to move differently, taking into account the way that habits get formed in the mind. Exactly. The Wikipedia article is good. And it's something that's offered in many music schools, although it's not a method for musicians specifically. And this has really helped me to, again, understand a little bit more about spontaneity and the way how we can kind of separate out our habits, which often feel spontaneous. Yeah, I think part of what you're talking about, these very different impressions of what the classical guitar world can be like, um, have to do with the demands of the repertoire, whereby the classical guitar doesn't really have, or did not used to have, a very extensive repertoire truly for beginners.
Mm.
So very often, taking your first lessons in classical guitar, you're already trying to learn pieces that put a lot of hands. So, for example, it might seem the most natural thing in the world. I'm trying to just turn around so you can see a little bit more of the guitar here for the visuals. But if you're doing something like this, that kind of thing's actually, for a little kid, extremely demanding.
Yeah.
Um, the demands on the left hand, although, from maybe like a teenage kid with a lot of aptitude, just like exactly the kind of thing they can pick up very fast. But for many kids, this is as soon as you start to show them this kind of thing, their whole bodies become racked with tension. Their necks, of course, have to go all the way around, and and all of this stuff kind of gets into the body. And the result is that many guitarists end up even reaching very high levels of performance, but that tension is still there. And that sense of always having to learn to some extent by rote, dealing with all of the contrapuntal and all of the layers of classical guitar music, means that many people have got into the habit early on of spending a lot of time just at the guitar, looking at the music, trying to hammer it into the hands. And all of this, of course, is a very anti-improvisational mindset. So if what many people are exploring now is a very different beginner's pedagogy, perhaps one that teaches people to develop this sense of the right hand patterns, but maybe the left hand at first is just simply balanced on the fingerboard, and they're just developing this kind of security in the hand. The left hand just develops much, much more slowly in tandem with the right hand. And then there's right away the possibility to play more expressively, to be able to think of what you're doing away from the instrument, to read better, not to be so dependent on reading the finger numbers or having fingering written in. This is all people are thinking have wonderful ideas about all of this. A lot of this was brought home to me by one of my old teachers, Richard Wright. In fact, what I was just showing you comes from an unpublished method book of his. And he and I have just written a book together. And he has a lot to say on this topic about developing these skills in a much more harmonious way. So, as things just gradually develop, uh, I think that improvisation will come a lot more naturally. So, a lot of it depends on your early experiences.
Y- Oh, sorry.
That's yeah. He
Yeah.
teaches at the Yehudi Menuhin School, so he's used to teaching with extremely talented youngsters. But a lot of his thinking is really about teaching anybody the basics.
You touched on a lot of interesting things, and I wanted to comment on this gravitational pull that guitarists have. It's kind of sad. It's away from just reading. It's almost like, and I love. I mean, he was my hero, Tommy Manuel, growing up, and he was my idol. But he would go on stage and say things like, "Oh, I never took a lesson," or I don't know how to read," and but he'd use that as some kind of like way to impress the audience, and all of that thing. And
Mm.
and Django Reinhardt didn't read, and but I feel like we need to come back to reading like this. Like Mozart could read, Bach could read, Beethoven could read, Franz Liszt could. They all could read, and that helped them be better composers. It's just part of being a musician. I mean, back then it was part of the culture of being a musician. But like, there's this pressure, right? If you're a guitarist, it's like I'm just gonna play. I'm gonna be a great improviser on the pentatonic scale, and there's that craftsmanship of learning to read is I'm a huge proponent of reading. Maybe I regret that it wasn't like pushed harder. But like, what do you think about this? That rote memorization is people do that more than they read. Like, you could actually be a pretty terrible reader if you spend all your time doing rote memorization.
Yeah. Rote memorization, as I say, is something that tends to be almost like a defense mechanism on the part of guitarists if they're introduced to too much repertoire too soon. And it's it has its place at first, maybe because sometimes people have a piece they want to play, and then they learn it by rote. Then over time, they grow out of the idea that there's a particular piece they want to play, um, and they're willing to do it the the slow, harmonious way. Um, so um, yeah, on the topic of rote memorization, I think a lot of it is just encouraging people to find the music in everything that they're playing, so that even if they're playing something very simple, they're getting a lot more fulfillment out of playing it because they can play it so well. Like, you could say that the enemy or the antidote to rote memorization is the experience of mastery. If you give somebody a very simple piece like the little thing I was starting to play a minute ago, but you know, even something as simple as those first few notes on the fourth string played with the thumb, that little rainbow dynamic that I did, Casals would call that shape a rainbow. Um, if it's played expressively and the kid has the experience of achieving that, um, then I think they know very clearly that what they're doing is good and beautiful and clear, expressive, all of these things. And then there's a sense of achievement that comes with that. Whereas if you learn a much more difficult piece by rote, there is so much insecurity in your own experience of playing the music. That you can only do it on a good day, that you always have to start from the beginning. You can't change anything. Someone makes a suggestion and you're unable to use that suggestion. Um, so I have a kind of a golden rule here, which is that in assigning repertoire to students, I try to think very much about, if they work hard, right? I want it to be a challenge, of course I do. But if they work hard and practice, will their performance basically be as good as anybody's? Will th- will they be playing it at the level of really any guitarist? Leaving aside um, all of the intricacies of like great artistry and so on. But if there's a piece of music for guitar that only really works if it's played with great artistry, I wouldn't assign that. But most music um, can really speak uh, very eloquently, even at levels than that. And I'm always trying to find music I think they can really do justice to. And that includes in the way they learn it.
Oh my goodness, the time. Look at this. We're at 39 minutes. I mean, we've just been having a blast here. I got to ask you a couple of questions now. Just rule of the octave on guitar. What's your position on that? I mean, when I went to Berkeley and we did jazz guitar, it's like if there is something complicated, it didn't matter. You did it in all keys, just all over the place. It didn't matter. It just made it work. But like I've heard for instance, rule of the octave on the guitar, maybe it's not a good idea to do that. Maybe take advantage of open strings. Maybe start off with positions, keys that are easier in the rule of the octave for the guitar. What do you say to that? I mean, or do you think just go for it and just kind of like throw yourself at it in all the keys, 24 keys and all that sort of thing? Do you think there should be best, maybe like most effective voicings first? What do you think about that rule of the octave on the guitar?
Well, I'm guided here by a beautiful book by the lutenist Peter Croton, Croton. And it's an introduction to playing figured bass on the guitar for classical guitarists. I'm pretty sure it was developed as like a useful textbook for classical guitarists at his conservatory who were taking some lessons, kind of on the side, I imagine, like one of those classes you take. Um, and I was this book really changed my way of thinking about how to teach this stuff, because before I was teaching basic progressions and trying to get my students to do them at a lot of keys. That's exactly the book. Now, what he does in this book is he teaches you the rule of the octave. It takes him about 10 lessons to do it. And after first introducing you to a few basic elements of figured bass, including playing in two voices, this is actually the rule of the octave in two voices. He has a way of teaching you. He then sticks a little cadence at the end. Now, let's say within 2 or 3 lessons, you're learning about the 6/3 chord that's typically found on scale degree 3, um, and then you learn to use the 4/3 chord of a scale 2 to connect those two. It takes them about 9 or 10 lessons to give you a complete scale up and down. And in the meantime, he's teaching you. He gives you little tunes that use what you know. Some of the tunes come back, and you learn ever more sophisticated harmonizations. And for until the rule of the octave is complete, he actually has you work only in C major and G major, the two most easy keys to play this on the guitar. And only then, at the very end of the book, does he then hit you with a bunch of other common keys. Not all of them, but the other common idiomatic ones that you're likely to encounter in real life. So it's an interesting book because, on the one hand, it's supposed to be a book, I think, really practical manual for someone who might end up doing some Baroque accompaniment. Through some of it, at least up to about those first 10 lessons, with all of my graduate and upper division students. because I want them to experience this way of knowing harmony rather than working with, or if, sorry, they've already worked with Roman numerals and they've already learned the kind of typical flow charts, that, 5 can go to 1 or it can go to 6, or it could maybe go to a first inversion 4 chord. Like they learn all of those kinds of weird procedural flowchart things. Uh, but, but a totally different way of thinking about music theory is how would you harmonize a scale in soprano or bass, actually, and how do you harmonize this kind of particular pattern? All of the little schemata that we find in Yerdinger and Eisenman and other texts. It doesn't take long before the rule of the octave shows up in guitar repertoire. If a student is, say, playing a transcription of Bach's Third Cello Suite, and they're playing the prelude, and they get to towards the end, that from the just going into the coda from the end of the prelude is literally, it turns out, one of Croton's exercises by accident. By accident, it just happens to coincide with, except that there's one chord, right? So we have that's octave in its most textbook form, except this extra chord. So if a student has been working on the rule of the octave, then first of all, they can learn that passage effortlessly because they know all of the chords. It's not just they know all of the chords, of course, they know this sequence, they know the way the bass is working, but also they can notice that remarkable chord, that remarkable 6/5 chord over the flat scale degree 3, and perhaps make something of it, right? Think about how it creates this very dramatic expressive effect of delay in the passage. Another thing to remember about the rule of the octave is it's still present in 19th century guitar methods. It's an extremely long-lived procedure. So if someone like Carulli was in the 19th century was still teaching it, well, then it's good enough for me. I didn't totally, well, I think I did address your question about different keys and so on. My initial approach was to teach a few simple things and really work the keys. But after looking at Croton, I decided to change my approach and focus on learning more in 2 or 3 common keys and then going into the other keys later on.
Okay, so you're a professor of music theory. You mentioned Roman numerals. You talked about Agerman. So where are we now in 2024? I mean, you should know you're in the UK. Thousands of children take these board exams, grade 5. They go for their written exam. They're labeling the Roman numeral.
Mm.
What do we do now? What should we do teaching children practical theory? I mean, is theory, what's the best way to go about it?
The we're partly talking about the theory of pedagogy, aren't we? Or the pedagogy of theory, or the
You
theory of the
can
pedagogy.
go any direction you want
Yeah.
to go.
Yeah, and well, all by way of saying that this is really outside my area of expertise. When I was teaching undergraduate theory um, here in America in Denver for freshmen and sophomores, I was quite impressed with the textbook by Stephen Lates, and also I've got it over there somewhere. Just give me 1 second because I want to give another shout out. Yeah, there's another book by Clendenning and Marvin West. Now, so some of these modern textbooks certainly teach the Roman numerals and the inversions and all of that, but they also have a healthy amount of rule of the octave kind of thinking, learning to harmonize patterns, recognizing them, and thinking about how the chords that you're using to harmonize those patterns aren't really the be all and end all. It's more about going from here to there. Now, I also teach, nowadays I teach, for the moment, graduate theory seminars. And so I get to choose a little bit more what we might focus on. For example, I teach a class on the music of Bach for performers. And the emphasis is really pretty much on anything I wish I had time to tell people in studio lessons that would help them learn Bach's music and play with more confidence. In terms of understanding the language. So it includes, for example, such things as schemata that crop up in Bach a lot. There's I think sometimes students want to do thorough Roman numeral analyses of the pieces that they're playing, and I absolutely don't discourage that. I think you want to give students all the leeway to explore theory and what they're learning and applying it to their repertoire as much as possible. But what I mostly encourage them to do is to convert that harmonic thinking into something they can play at the guitar. So if they're learning 19th century studies that consist of a lot of arpeggios and passing tones, that kind of thing, decorative figuration, then if we can reduce those to the basic chords and then learn to play those expressively, then it's like they're doing a Roman numeral analysis, but with the fingers, learning these patterns. And then sometimes a good thing to pursue is decorating those patterns in your own way. So somewhere on YouTube, I have a video about this stuff, about improvisation and Baroque music, and I go through the rule of the octave on the guitar and demonstrate some ways of working with schemata. And something that I found quite useful that isn't in that video is just the idea of making the exactly, well, okay, so look at that example there. Right there on the screen is gosh, there's a lot there, isn't there? There's Bach's Fourth Cello Suite Prelude. Guitar's going a bit crazy. It's out in the cold all night, and now it's got a warm body. Okay, so this is a well-known cello prelude that can be played very nicely on the guitar. It starts like this. Okay, and so on. And the bass starts to move. Now, on the top there, we have the chords. So what I'd have my student do is learn the piece as a chord progression. So I'll play some of those chords for you only like quadruple speed. Not only because our time is limited, but because this is also a way of connecting with the harmonies more clearly, right? If you hear them, if you hear the flow of the harmonies, Bach is going to really stretch out these harmonies over large period, several beats. But if I just play second downbeat, now I can really hear how he goes to that chromatic chord. Okay, now we can take that chord
Such a
progression.
beautiful instrument. I mean, the guitar is such a beautiful instrument. Really
Kind of
nice.
also, when you hear the chords moving much more quickly, it's almost like slow practice turned around, isn't it? That you're actually hearing the connections at a rate at which you can take them in, and then when you add when you add Bach's pattern, you can feel the ebb and flow of the harmonies so much more quickly. But to seal these harmonies in my into my memory, into my awareness, it's good if I can play around with them a little bit. So we've already got pretty much just one note per chord. What if I make it two notes per chord? So let's say I could always add an extra note if I need to, or not always play an extra note on the. So that was two notes roughly per
That was great.
chord.
That's what we all need to do. That's just wonderful.
Okay. Well, let's try three notes per measure, so to speak. Let's see. So something like. So on.
That
That's
is
three. It's almost like
ridiculous. It's so beautiful. Oh, that's so beautiful. Obviously, like the style is great. The improvisation, like people would all like, it's like, where's the sheet music for that? I remember 20 years ago, before the internet, everyone was like, what was that piece? Do you have the sheet music for that? Because if it's like, like, no one believed that you could improvise that sort of thing. But there you are, you're doing it. And even the two notes was good. I mean, it's just so strong, the material. The material is so strong.
It's the material, yeah. It's the material. And
No,
if people
wait,
go
so
to that video,
how
they can.
long does it take for you to do that?
I think it's more like there's just first you have to make the reduction, of course, which you can see in that particular piece. It's pretty straightforward. Often you just have to just verticalize the arpeggios. But as the piece goes on, Bach starts to do other things, and he kind of puts the figuration into kind of a stress test. So instead of something like, he might have something like, right, where gradually the arpeggio is kind of starting to have other notes attached to it, dissonances and so on. When I give this to students to do, sometimes interesting questions come up. I think just the point is to do a lot of it, and just do a little bit here. If you do what I just showed is a little bit inspired by species counterpoint teaching, right? Where you're given a cantus firmus, you write one note per note counterpoint, then two notes against it, when you can start to use passing tones, and then three notes. I used to teach a class in that back in London, and so that again I found very useful. But it's that stuff is super strict, and It's the kind of class where students can be discouraged by the amount of red ink they get back on their work. Whereas if you're just saying, well, take this, and sometimes you go, just no one's checking up on exactly how many notes you're playing per chord.
You brought up counterpoint. Okay, so this is a specific question just for the guitar. The guitar is not like the piano. What do you say about situations where you have to do an octave leap? Does that affect do you worry about parallels? Do you worry about things?
Right, yeah.
So like what's in your mind when you're improvising? And you mentioned counterpoint. How do you keep that safe on the guitar?
It's quite it's a technical question. Like if you're doing a strict counterpoint class, then there's so many places you have to look where you could be breaking a rule. You could break a rule like this. Right, where the downbeats are having these very prominent octaves. But you could also break a rule more obviously by going right where it's literally the two intervals moving in octaves. Same with fifths. If you then look at some real music, like say a Schubert song, which is a free compositional style, it's in an idiom. Then very often, as the voice is decorating, then sometimes the last eighth note in the bar or the last quaver in the bar does form a parallel octave or fifth with the bass, but especially an octave, I think. So it partly depends on what style you have in mind. I guess I'd come back to the pedagogy of this. So when I'm teaching this, I suggest to students just not to worry about these things. So with students, one of the things we try is just simple Renaissance chord progressions. And again, I got this from Croton. I mean, it's obvious, but round about lesson 2, he gives you just that. La Bergamasca, 1451. And he says, oh, you could use this for improvisation. But he doesn't say how or, what might be a good way of exploring this. And I don't know about you, but when someone says use that for improvisation, my immediate thought is, oh my God, I'm going to have to do these elaborate solos over this chord progression. Where do I start? So I thought quite a bit about how to help students get started that isn't in that kind of jazz mentality of somehow knowing out of nowhere to be how to do these elaborate solos. So what we do is there's a few components to this. Hopefully I already answered the question about don't worry about parallel fifths and octaves, but it's in this context of doing this kind of activity. The first thing is you need a vehicle for people to be able to improvise in. So we form a group. Maybe everybody is just gently playing these chords. Maybe someone is going. So you have a sense of something very sustaining in the rhythm. And then the first thing is to create a call and response out of this. So if the first voice leading is on scale degree 3, dum, we can then have a riposte, as Yerdinger might say, dum, dum, dum. Now already I just got 4 chords. I got 8 out of the 4 chords by repeating it and having the perfect authentic cadence the second time. Then we can play that whole thing twice. One of the things I learned from looking at old Baroque guitar pieces and also hearing what modern specialists in period Baroque guitar playing do is that very often you have these kinds of loose pieces like a Canarios or a Fandango or something like that, where a lot of it is just playing some cool riffs over a chord progression, then doing it twice. Because if you play something twice, and so it exhausts itself in the short term, and people feel ready for something else. So I can get 8 bars that way by doing this. Does that make sense? That's
Stretch it
just
out. Get more stuff out of it.
yeah. But first we took scale degree 3 to scale degree 1 over 2 phrases. Then we just did it again. Then if you say to people, the first thing I would have people do is try and play around with rhythms. Because when people start to improvise, they forget about simple resources like long notes, repeated notes, and rests. So I think the first thing to go around the room is just to go like, and so on. What I have people do is work with just rhythm alone, but then they must play it twice. But of course, not literally. If they want to, if they can play it literally twice, fine. But just roughly repeat it. And then that way, each person gets a turn, which isn't just like playing 4 bars and then moving on and then stewing for like 3 minutes until it's their turn again. You have a little bit of time just to play. Then we can do call and response. Like someone can play, and then the next person, and then they can repeat that amongst themselves. Then again, just following that kind of simple model of can you just, as you get almost tired and bored of doing that, sooner or later you're going to go, just start to play other notes that lie under the fingers in those chords. From there, we can start to fill in, and so on. And at each stage, there are interesting things for people to notice. For example, if students fill in passing tones, they'll tend to fill in the passing tones in place like this. And they forget that they could go, see what I mean? Where you still have the 3 notes with the passing tone, but you play it in a more natural rhythm. Long, short, short. And then from there, we can start to add typical ornamental decorative patterns, and can be built up like that until people just have the experience uh, uh, of their fingers doing it for them. What I find is that when we go around the room like this, often in a large group, older students, younger students may often just freeze, but luckily they have a bit of time to experiment. Older students often get very ambitious very fast and try to play elaborate scales that don't quite land, on the next change of chord. That's all fine. It's all fine. I'm not there to tell people to do anything different, but we might have a bit of discussion afterwards. But when it comes back round to me, what I like to do is play the simplest possible thing I can think of, like I was just doing. So if someone's just tried to go da da dee da 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 da, and got a little bit lost and confused, then when it comes back to me, or sorry, not even that, maybe just something reminding them, look, you can just do this. One of the marks of skill is actually being able to do something very simple. Like when you're in a foreign country and you don't speak the language very well and want to express yourself. I mean, my experience is that you you're thinking in English, and then you try and say something super complicated and translate it into that foreign language in real time, and then of course you crash and burn very fast. When you get actually a little bit better at with you get much better at just saying what you know how to say and making it count, right?
We just use the Google
Um,
Translate now. Now that's what we're gonna do.
did do that, yeah. Yeah, when you kind of progress from a beginner to intermediate to more advanced, you just learn to speak simply. Because you're speaking a foreign language, so you're not going to be able to say that complex sentence structure. And then from there, of course, your speaking does get more complex in its own time. But a lot of that is just getting the input from people talking to you. So I feel like improvisation is the same. When you first start, you might sometimes feel like you can do nothing, and at other times you try and do something very complicated that you're unable to sustain or you can't land the plane. As you get better, you learn actually just to make a few notes count, to play a simple rhythm, to let a long note sit for a moment, or not play at all until there is a moment where you can make a contribution. And I feel like that's one of the great gifts of learning to do this is is learning how to simplify. Has a lot of implications for performance in general, right?
What does this do to repertoire now? I feel like repertoire suddenly is like something like a buffet. Like you want to grab stuff that you see. You want to have lots of repertoire. You want to read a lot. It's just like it's not just you play this at a show and then you play the next thing at another show. It's like you're reading stuff, you're absorbing stuff. Repertoire becomes this repository that you just draw from, and your own individuality comes out of your favorite things from the repertoire. I feel like it's not an enemy. Repertoire and improvisation, they're not like two enemies. They're like they really work together because we see this with the pianists in any biography. They love certain composers that comes out. Tchaikovsky, like Schumann, Liszt, and Liszt like Hummel, and it just I feel like. What do you think of that now? What happens to the classical guitar repertoire uh, when you're learning to improvise? And can you speak about the 19th century now? If we move away from Galant and Baroque, the
Mm.
guitar really came into prominence, I guess, with in the 19th century, right? I mean, that's really Sohr, Giuliani, Carulli. They were really, and then the harmony changes in the 19th century. So, how do you tackle improvisation in a later style, like in the 19th century? Sorry, there's a lot of questions there, but
Mm.
just tackle as many as you like.
I think a lot of what I'm doing in this conversation is picking on some key words and trying to say something. I feel I have something useful to say because some of the questions I need to think about and have better answers for. um, when it comes to one thing about repertoire is that it's just been on my mind recently. I don't know. Again, using the language learning analogy, when we learn languages in school, or at least typically when I was young, there's all of these worked exercises and grammar and vocabulary lists you have to do. And you often end up looking at the language through a tiny keyhole, really. The few words you know, the few little grammar rules, some set phrases. And the whole time you're kind of intensively studying new difficulties in the language. But research in language learning shows that really that should just be a tiny part of what you do. That what you need is enormous amounts of input. So you need to be um, uh, if you can find, even if you're a beginner, you're learning, say, Spanish, if you can find a podcast in which someone is just speaking or people are speaking for hours and hours in very, very simple Spanish, slowly enough that you can understand it, you need to do a lot of that because you're taking it in, you know, getting the messages, producing your own messages in real expressive situations that are not things like role spitting out set things, but actually in some simple situation introducing yourself. But it seems like maybe an estimate's put the amount of time spent studying grammar and vocabulary at about a quarter of what you should be doing. And the rest of the time, immersing yourself in other ways in the language. Now, learning to play an instrument, learning to play the classical guitar, as a teacher, I spend a lot of my time on that kind of intensive study where people are playing a few pieces that they've got to learn for their recital or for the class in front of the students or for the ensemble concert. So we're constantly dealing with small amount of music, solving problems, and the music is hard for them. What I tend to forget is that when I was 11, 12, 13 years old, I went every weekend to my local music library, took out 5 books of guitar music, some of them anthologies, and played through everything. Whether I could play it or not, I mean, including stuff I couldn't even see how it could possibly be played. But I tried to anyway, and I did that for years.
Listen
So
to
I was
that.
playing.
That's it. That's right there. That's the
That
key.
is it. My my teacher would say things like, "Okay, you've got this piece. You've learnt the prelude. Now for next week, maybe just very slowly start going through the Allemande." And I didn't like to say to him, "Oh, I already read through the whole suite and 5 other books of pieces." But the thing was that I remember that my attitude in all of that, particularly as I got a bit older and was in my later teens and starting to get very serious about concerts and doing the odd competition and so on, was that I continued to read through all of the music that I was interested in, just out of interest. Um, but I but I took very seriously my teacher's instructions on what was like my official repertoire. So if he said, for example, let's study Benjamin Britten's Nocturnal, one of the great guitar concert pieces. I remember saying to him, well, Gordon, his name was Gordon Kroskio, a very important teacher of young people in England. So, Gordon, are you sure? Are you sure I'm ready for this piece? He said, yes, sure. We'll take some time over it. Do a few lessons. Let's start. Yeah, bring it next time, and we'll start working through. What I didn't say in that conversation was I already have it memorized, because I didn't consider that to be what he was talking about, right? Doing a real performance of it. So when I asked, "Am I ready for this piece?" it was a genuine question, but to me that didn't include the idea that I wouldn't have it memorized and know it extremely well already. To me, that was just part of playing, of having fun, of entertaining myself and pursuing my passions. So something I've been thinking about a lot recently is there a way that I can encourage, and in a way, what kind of structure can I create for my students whereby they feel able to devote a lot of their practice time to playing whatever they want, whatever they care about, whatever interests them. And I'm still thinking about it. So if people have got ideas about this, how to fit this into a university curriculum, I'd love to hear
We have to change the
them.
culture like across the whole world. I mean, we just have to change the whole culture,
Yeah,
because I think yeah, it needs a system-wide change, I think. So
yeah. Input is everything, and obviously, if your fingers have gone through these patterns many, many times, then when you're eventually taught a schema or a Roman numeral progression, well, no, whatever the framework your teacher is giving you or you're reading about, you'll think, oh yeah, I know that. Oh yeah, oh that's that piece. So an awful lot of the repertoire that I've known since I was not even a teen, not even a teenager, is stuff that I always feel like I'm in the process of relearning it and realizing how much simpler it was than it seemed at the time. Because it's just in this Bach bourrée, he's just doing up a step, down a third, up a step, down a third. It's that pattern. But I never realized that, when I was learning it. And now it's just that, and it's simple. It's like Bach's just improvising on it. So input is everything. Passion is everything. Following your enthusiasms, cultivating enthusiasms is everything. And I also think that this is very important. Well, the flip side of this is that I think it's then okay for any performer to have a very carefully curated, limited concert repertoire. So, one model that I think might be useful for people to have in mind is knowing enormous amounts of repertoire, even having it memorized, but performing from month to month, year to year, a limited amount, being quite intentional about what you play next. If you're talking here, I'm talking about if you're doing full solo recitals. Because I believe that for longevity in a career, it's a good idea to, in every concert, to be working with deep reserves of muscle memory. Anyone who's had an injury like me will know that there's something odd, which is that if you have to play a concert while there's some injury you're dealing with, a lack of something where you have lack of control or some pain, for some reason, pieces that you've been playing for many, many years are way easier to play under those circumstances than equally easy pieces that you've just learned, or that you only learned a year before, something like that. I think that probably intuitively makes sense, right? They're just somehow you're drawing on different neural pathways to send those messages, and it's just easier to bypass the injuries, the pains, the fatigue, whatever, than with stuff that isn't that's much newer to you. So because so many classical guitarists do develop injuries to one hand or another, again, that's made me think that the trick is to learn as much music as possible, as early as possible, in a kind of a casual way.
Yeah.
But to be careful about how many difficult pieces you take on for concert performance.
So to end off, Professor Leathwood, it's been a really fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed it. Let's end off with maybe composition. You are a composer yourself. Um, Classical guitarist students, how should they be encouraged to compose? And I also want you to mention your book that you wrote. I think you're writing a book. Have you already published it? That has a chapter on improvisation. So let's end off with the topic of conversation, and I'd love for you to mention your book.
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. And sorry I didn't talk about the 19th century in the last thing. I guess I had a rant that was wanting to come out about this, about input, and
Let's
I've
do
never
it.
got to deliver it at all.
Episode 2.
Yeah, 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 because the 19th century, yeah, I'd love to get into that sometime. But okay, well, I'm not a composer in the sense of like some of the great guitar composers like Steve Goss, Leo Brouwer, Roland Dion's, where there's a have the only pieces I have published are in pedagogical contexts, ensemble pieces for younger players, even some sight reading pieces in one volume. But um, but I have explored composition quite a bit, and I've even taught composition a little bit. What question would you say would be good to address on this?
Well, I mean, we don't compose at all. I mean, in classical guitar, I mean, it's very few. It's the freaks, the really talented ones. But the vast majority of students don't really get a taste of it, and then it's like something that they don't really
Yeah,
do. I mean, we talked about improvisation. They don't do that either. So, what about composition?
no. I think composition, again, students may have various self-imposed blocks that come from a misconception about what composing is. Um, so I think a lot of what we talked about with improvisation is the same thing. It's taking sounds and things that interest you, and learning how to not being afraid just to take them for um, on a journey of some sort. Um, and often students in composition, uh, they're generally good at coming up with an idea for a composition. It's just continuing it that is hard. And so simple strategies like introducing a contrasting idea and putting them in conversation um, can really get students thinking differently and working differently. Something else I've suggested is that something that very often happens in the repertoire is that a composer is modeling their writing on something. So I'll come back to my book in a second, but an example I give in the book is that say you're playing a piece like Brouwer's First Sonata. it kind of goes on like that, gradually building up. Sorry. One way to work on practicing a piece like this is just to take those gestures, which have certain technical difficulties about them, like playing clear harmonics, playing these little gruppetti, to style with a noctatonic mode and so on. But you might just take your own language like the white notes of the piano. Now there I'm just playing notes with no accidentals, but using the same gestures and also the same kind of order of events, but just kind of exploring with my own fingers, with what I happen to know. I could use more complex scales. I could start, and take that for now. What I've got there is actually a little prelude to the sonata. So from there, well, the improvisation feeds into learning the music, but you also end up with something you yourself can use, right? You could say a little study after Brouwer, a prelude after Brouwer. And you know something more about the technical difficulties of the piece, you know something more about the sonata. But as with almost anything worthwhile, there's like some extra enriching thing that's a little harder to put into words. And in a way, it's your own composition at that point. After all, Brouwer himself, like many composers today, is also often quoting, drawing on other things, using the work of others as a model to create something new. So we can do that ourselves.
Fantastic. Well, the great Professor Jonathan Leathwood. Want to mention your book really quickly?
The title of the book is hilarious because the title is Guitar. And the reason it's called Guitar is that there's a series of books called the Yehudi Menuhin Music Guides that started coming out, I think, in the 1980s. And each book is devoted to an instrument. So there's a Yehudi Menuhin Music Guide, piano, cello, violin, and viola. And those were written in the 80s and 90s by, I think, um, who are generally colleagues of Yehudi Menuhin, the great violinist, or yes, I'm trying to get the lack of cover image sorted out on Amazon. But the idea of the book is that if you're a young student, a young guitarist interested in becoming a performer in due course, or you teach such a person, or you're a performer or a student who's just interested in exploring your passion for the instrument. Like, the idea of the book is to stimulate new ideas, to get people thinking about interesting aspects of technique, repertoire, interpretation, and so on. And indeed, there's a chapter called Creative Practicing in there, in which I suggest that literally anything you want to do in the practice room, that you need to work on in the practice room, such as a technical difficulty, simulating some kind of new stylistic element like an unfamiliar style or a difficult or a polyrhythm or something of that nature, whatever the difficulty is, it can be approached through improvisation. And that often the deepest, most useful learning is done alongside all of that repetitive practice that we have to do, perhaps with all the traditional ways. But there's a lot of deep learning that can happen when you take those difficulties and create something out of them in the practice room. So you're not just practicing what's in front of you on the music, but creating your own thing and then coming back to the music with kind of a renewed insights. So that's one of the things that's in the book. I also want to mention that there's a whole chapter on the process of collaborating with composers, which is also a very much a situation which you may end up improvising with a composer. So some of the pieces that I've worked on with composers, with new commissions, has involved me taking a technique or a texture and improvising on it while a composer listens or even records it. And then they go away and do their own thing with it, but they get an idea of what it can sound like. Sometimes you get to know a composer's language and then they write an impossible chord or an impossible pattern. It can't be played on the six strings. And then you say, well, what if it was more like this? Because this chord is possible. And in that moment, if you can do it in such a way that it sounds like the music of the composer, it's very valuable for them. So again, there's an improvisatory element there. So I try and address that in the book as well. The co-author is Richard Wright, who, as I've mentioned, is a tremendous pedagogue. And so about half of the book is by him and half of it is by me. But there's hopefully a lot in there to stimulate people.
Well, I mean, I really had a great, yeah, we have so much more to talk about. 19th century. I wanted to talk also about things like, yeah, more compositional stuff, more music theory stuff, but it'll have to wait for our second episode, which I think really should be coming. So we should do that again soon because it's been a real pleasure. Professor
It'll be
Leathwood.
a lot of fun to talk more about those things. Yeah.
Yeah, we just ran out of time. We should extend this to Joe Rogan style, like 4 hours, and maybe that'll work. I did one 4-hour Parlamento episode for New Year's with Matteo Massari. It was a lot of fun, but it was tiring. It was tiring. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just wanted to end off with saying I think you really sold me. I just listening to you improvising over the Bach. I love that. I think that's like a sales pitch for learning the classical guitar. If anybody just saw that, wait, he's just coming up with that on the spot, and it's so beautiful and really like that would inspire anyone. I think it makes me want to grab the guitar and mess around with, because the timbre, the something about that instrument is I mean, it's just so popular. It's such a beautiful instrument. It'll always be popular. So, Professor Leathwood, let's do it again, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks so much, Nikhil. It's great to talk with you. Thanks for your wonderful questions. you.